Hello everyone, my name is Maria Lorena Ancheta, and my topic for today is case control study. For the objectives, the study aims to give a brief introduction regarding the overview of study designs, to define case control study, to delineate the overview of the advantages and disadvantages of case control study, and to discuss the major types of case control studies. Traditionally, case control studies have been viewed as an alternative to cohort studies in which individuals were selected on the basis of whether or not they had a disease outcome of interest, with investigators comparing exposure history between those with disease and those free of the disease. So here's the overview of study designs. And as you can see, case control studies are more prone to bias. So when you cannot find a cohort study to answer your prognosis or etiology, look for a case control study. Case control studies. It is the observational epidemiologic study of persons with a disease of interest and a suitable control group of persons without the disease. It is also a case control study that involves two populations, the cases and the controls, and has three distinct features. Both exposure and outcome have occurred before the start of the study. The study proceeds backwards from effect to cause. It also uses a control or comparison group to support or refute an inference. Why case control study? Compared to prospective cohort studies, case control study tends to be less costly and shorter in duration. In several situations, they have greater statistical power than cohort studies, which must often wait for a sufficient number of disease events to accumulate. Here are the advantages and disadvantages of case control study compared to cohort study. So the measurement that used in case control study is odds ratio only, while in cohort study they uses incidence rate and relative rate. It is also Case control study is also inexpensive and short in term compared to cohort study. Case control study are more powerful with small cases or small sample cases, and they are limited to rare exposure, and case control study can be used or good for rare disease or only one disease. They are also potentially less strong and probably not generalizable. Here are the major types of case control study. First is the population-based control study, where cases and controls are recruited from population. Next is case control study nested in cohort study, where cases and controls are registered in a cohort study. And third, hospital-based case control study, where cases and controls are patients who are hospitalized or outpatients. So here are the issues in the design of case control studies. First is the selection of cases. All people in source population who develop the disease of interest, including the sample of cases, independent of the exposure under study. And it is also clear in definition of outcome studied and prevalent versus incident cases, where prevalent cases may be related more to survival with disease than to development of disease. For the sources of cases, cases may be recruited from a number of sources. For example, they may be recruited from a hospital, clinic, or GP registers, or maybe population basis. Population-based case control studies are generally more expensive and difficult to conduct. Next is the selection of controls. It represents the distribution of exposure in the source population of cases, where they select from the same source of population that gives rise to the same cases. And they also select independently of their exposure status. So here are the bias in case control studies. So when we say bias, it is a systematic error in design, conduct, or analysis of a study which leads us to an erroneous conclusion. So due to the retrospective nature of case control studies, they are particularly susceptible to the effects of bias, which may be introduced as a result of a poor study design or during the collection of exposure and outcome data. So first is the bias in selection of cases, where selection bias or diagnostic bias, and second, bias in investigating controls, where recall bias, the controls are less likely to recall exposure variables than the cases. The interview, test, investigation may lack depth in controls, whereas the cases are thoroughly worked up. Third is the confounding bias, where distortion of a study effect with another effect because of variables extraneous to the exposure affecting the prediction of the disease will lead to the disease where it has a multiple risk factors which are related to each other, and the solution will be matching between cases and controls. Fourth is the problems due to overmatching. This is where a potential confounder is matched among cases and controls. The study thus loses the power of proving an obvious association. Bias in analysis. The presence of a confounder is mostly identified at the time of analysis. It is due to non-uniform distribution of confounders, and the solution is stratification, where it limits the size of study and there are number of confounding factors. So here are the strengths and weaknesses of case control studies. For its strengths, it is good for examining rare outcomes or outcomes with long latency, relatively quick to conduct or inexpensive, requires comparatively few subjects, and multiple exposures or risk factors can be examined. And for its weaknesses, it is susceptible to recall bias. Selection of an appropriate comparison group may be difficult. Its rates of disease in exposed and unexposed individuals cannot be determined, and case control study is also susceptible to recall bias. And in selection of an appropriate comparison group may be difficult, and rates of disease in exposed and unexposed individuals cannot be determined. So this is the end of my report.